Jared. Jared is a given name of biblical derivation. Origin. In the book of Genesis, the biblical patriarch Jared was the sixth in the 10 pre-flood generations between Adam and Noah. He was the son of Mahalaleel and the father of Enoch. The biblical text in Jubilees implicitly etymologizes the name as derived from the root yrd descend, because in his days the angels of the Lord descended to earth. Alternative suggestions for the name's etymology include words for rose, servant, and one who rules. Yared 505–571, a namesake, was an Ethiopian bishop who introduced the concept of sacred music to Ethiopian Orthodox services. He is regarded as a saint of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church with a feast day of 11 Genbat May 19. People, arts, entertainment, and media. Jared Abrahamson, born 1987, Canadian actor. Jared Allman, born 1984, American actor. Jared Anderson, Christian musician, born 1979, American musician and Christian worship leader. Jared Anderson, heavy metal musician, 1974–2006, American musician. Jared Angira, born 1947, Kenyan poet and author. Jared Angle, American ballet dancer. Jared Artaud, American musician. Jared Morris Arter, 1850–1930, American author and former slave. Jared Bull, born 1971, American author and radio host. Jared Drake Bell, born 1986, American actor and singer. Jared Blake, born 1978, American musician and actor. Jared Bowen, American journalist and reporter. Jared Breeze, born 2005, American child actor. Jared Bush, born 1974, American screenwriter, television producer. Jared Byers, American musician. Jared Carter, born 1939, American author and editor. Jared Campbell, born 1989, American stand-up comedian and former football player. Jared Cohn, American film director, screenwriter, and actor. Jared Cohan, born 1947, American author, editor, engineer. Jared Cole, American physicist. Jared Kohlinger, American musician. Jared Cotter, born 1981, American musician. Jared Curtis, born 1936, American author and editor. Jared Daparis, born 1990, Australian actor. Jared De Pasquale, born 1971, American film, television, and audio drama composer. Jared Diamond, born 1937, American scientist and author. Jared Dines, born 1989, American musician and YouTuber. Jared Elliott, 1685–1763, American colonial minister, physician, and agronomist. Jared Emerson Johnson, born 1981, American video game music composer and voice actor. Jared Evan, born 1989, American musician. Jared Bradley Flagg, 1820–1899, American painter. Jared Faber, American film, television producer, and musician. Jared Falk, born 1981, Canadian musician. Jared Farmer, born 1974, American historian and author. Jared Fogle, born 1977, American former spokesman for Subway and registered sex offender. Jared Followill, born 1986, American musician. Jared French, 1905–1988, American painter. Jared Friedman, born 1984, American entrepreneur and investor. Jared Gertner, American actor. Jared Gilman, born 1998, American actor. Jared Gilmore, born 2000, American actor. Jared Gold, born 1972, American fashion designer. Jared Gold, organist, American musician. Jared Gomes, born 1968, American musician and activist. Jared Ian Goldman, born 1979, American film and television producer. Jared Lee Gosselin, born 1981, American record producer. Jared J. Grantham, 1936–2017, American physician, nephrologist, and author. Jared Gutstedt, born 1977, Canadian-born American music executive. Jared Hampton, born 1990, American musician. Jared Harris, born 1961, British actor. Jared Hartman, born 1985, American musician. Jared Hasselhoff, born 1971, American musician and actor. Jared Hauser, born 1971, American musician and professor. Jared Hecht, born 1987, American entrepreneur. Jared Hedges, born 1980, American screenwriter, television producer, and video games. Jared Hess, born 1979, American filmmaker. Jared Heyman, American entrepreneur. Jared Isakman, born 1983, American businessman. Jared Israel, born 1944, American writer, activist, and conspiracy theorist. Jared Jussum, born 1935, American lawyer, actor, and former executive vice president at Sony Pictures. Jared Kiso, born 1984, Canadian actor. Jared Cooper, Canadian musician, record producer, and audio engineer. Jared Kusnitz, born 1988, American actor. Jared Lane, born 1972, New Zealand artist and illustrator. Jared Lee, born 1943, Canadian artist and cartoonist. Jared Layer, American jewelry fashion designer. Jared Leto, born 1971, American actor and musician. Jared Louch, born 1960, American musician. Jared Mac Eachern, born 1980, American musician. Jared Marston, Australian musician and DJ producer. Jared Martin, 1940–2017, American actor. Jared McLeod, born 1980, American musician. Jared Mezaki, born 1985, American theater projection designer and director. Jared Mitchell, writer, born 1955, Canadian journalist and author. Jared Morgenstern, born 1981, American designer and entrepreneur. Jared Moshe, American film director, screenwriter, and producer. Jared Murillo, born 1988, American dancer, singer, and actor. Jared Nathan, 1985–2006, American child actor. Jared James Nichols, born 1989, American musician. Jared Nissim, born 1973, American businessman. Jared Overton, American musician. Jared Padalecki, born 1982, American actor. Jared Palomer, American musician. Jared Pappas Kelly, born 1974, American curator, author, and visual artist. Jared Paul, American talent manager and producer. Jared Pelletier, born 1990, Canadian director. Jared Poitras, born 1985, Japanese-born American music producer and DJ. Jared Purton, 1976–2009, Australian-born immunologist. Jared Rigsby, American musician. Jared Robinson, born 1963, Australian actor. Jared Rushton, born 1974, American musician and actor. Jared Sapphire, born 1982, American television and film producer. Jared Yates Sexton, born 1981, American author and political commentator. Jared Shavelson, American musician. Jared Slingerland, born 1984, Canadian musician. Jared Van Snellenberg, born 1980, Canadian actor. Jared Sorensen, indie role-playing game designer. Jared Southwick, 1976–2011, American musician. Jared Spears, born 1936, American musician. Jared Spool, born 1960, American author, public speaker, and consultant. Jared Paul Stern, born 1971, American journalist, photographer, and designer. Jared Swilly, born 1983, American musician. Jared Taylor, born 1951, American white supremacist and author. Jared Thomas, born 1976, Australian author. Jared Tinklenberg, American psychiatrist and author. Jared Sidney Torrance, 1853–1921, American businessman and real estate developer. Jared Turner, born 1978, New Zealand-born Australian actor. Jared Tyler, born 1978, American musician. Jared Wade, born 1989, American musician. Jared Warren, American musician. Jared Worth, born 1986, American musician. Jared Bell Waterbury, 1799–1876, American minister and author. Jared Yates, American Idol contestant. Government and politics. Jared Benson, 1821–1894, American politician. Jared Bernstein, born 1955, American economist, author, and advisor at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Jared Brossett, born 1982, American politician. Jared M. Brush, 1814–1895, American politician, 28th Mayor of Pittsburgh, PA. Jared Cohen, born 1981, American businessman, author, and advisor at the Council on Foreign Relations. Jared Genser, international human rights lawyer, author, and advisor at the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. Jared Golden, born 1982, American politician. Jared Comstock Gregory, 1823–1892, American politician, 12th Mayor of Madison, WI. Jared Hegwood, American author and writer for the United States Naval Oceanographic Office. Jared Henderson, American politician. Jared Huffman, born 1964, American politician. Jared Ingersoll Chipman, 1788–1832, Nova Scotian lawyer and politician. Jared Ingersoll, 1749–1822, American politician. Jared Ingersoll, Sr., 1722–1781, American Stamp Act agent. Jared Irwin, 1750–1818, American politician, 22nd Governor of Georgia. Jared Irwin, Pennsylvania politician, 1768–1818, American politician and zoologist. Jared Potter Kirtland, 1793–1877, American politician. Jared Kushner, born 1981, American businessman and senior advisor to President Donald Trump. Jared Maddox, 1911–1971, American politician. Jared Mansfield, 1759–1830, American mathematician, professor at the United States Military Academy, and Surveyor General of the Northwest Territory. Jared Mead, born 1991, American politician. Jared Moskowitz, born 1980, American politician. Jared Nunes, born 1982, American politician. Jared Olson, born 1987, American politician. Jared O'Mara, born 1981, former British politician. Jared Patterson, American politician. Jared Paul Stratton, American politician. Jared V. Peck, 1816–1891, American politician. Jared Perkins, 1793–1854, American politician. Jared Polis, born 1975, American politician, 43rd Governor of Colorado. Jared Y. Sanders, Jr., 1892–1960, American lawyer and politician. Jared Y. Sanders, Sr., 1869–1944, American politician. Jared Solomon, born 1978, American politician. Jared Solomon, Maryland politician, American politician. Jared Sparks, 1789–1866, American historian and politician. Jared Thompson, Jr., 1836–1914, American lawyer and politician. Jared C. Troup, 1837–1876, Canadian lawyer and politician. Jared Weinstein, born 1979, former government official and personal aide to the 43rd President of the United States. Jared Whittaker, 1818–1884, American newspaperman and politician. Jared W. Williams, 1796–1864, American lawyer and politician. Jared Williams, Virginia politician, 1766–1831, American politician. Jared Woodfill, born 1968, American lawyer and politician. Jared Wright, American newspaper editor and former politician. Sports. Jared Abradiris, born 1990, American football player. Jared Allen, born 1982, American football player. Jared Allen, quarterback, born 1981, American football coach and former player. Jared Anderson, boxer, born 1999, American boxer. Jared Olin, born 1982, Canadian ice hockey player. Jared Barker, born 1975, Canadian rugby union player. Jared Bednar, born 1972, Canadian ice hockey coach and former player. Jared Benko, American athletic director. Jared Berggren, born 1990, American basketball player. Jared Bird, born 1997, English football player. Jared Bidwell, born 1987, Australian rower. Jared Bull, born 1986, American ice hockey player. Jared Borghetti, born 1973, Mexican football player. Jared Brennan, born 1984, Australian rules football player. Jared Brown, born 1973, American football player. Jared Brownridge, born 1994, American basketball player. Jared Burton, born 1981, American baseball player. Jared Butler, born 2000, American basketball player. Jared Canadier, born 1984, American mixed martial artist. Jared Kloss, born 1981, American football player. Jared Connaughton, born 1985, Canadian sprinter. Jared Cook, born 1987, American football player. Jared Coro, born 1991, Canadian ice hockey player. Jared Cowan, born 1991, Canadian ice hockey player. Jared Crick, born 1989, American football player. Jared Crouch, born 1978, Australian rules football player. Jared Cunningham, born 1991, American basketball player. Jared Curtis, footballer, born 1979, Samoan football player. Jared Deacon, born 1975, British sprinter. Jared DeMitchell, born 1985, American ice hockey coach and former player. Jared DeVries, born 1976, American football player. Jared Dillinger, born 1984, Filipino-American basketball player. Jared Donaldson, born 1996, American tennis player. Jared Downing, born 1989, American mixed martial artist. Jared Dudley, born 1985, American basketball player. Jared Elliott, American football coach. Jared Embick, born 1978, American soccer coach and former player. Jared Fernandez, born 1972, American baseball player. Jared Frayer, born 1978, American wrestler. Jared Gaither, born 1986, American football player. Jared Garcia, born 1982, American BMX rider. Jared Goff, born 1994, American football player. Jared Goldberg, born 1991, American alpine skier. Jared Gomes, ice hockey, born 1988, Canadian ice hockey player. Jared Gordon, born 1988, American mixed martial artist. Jared Grasso, born 1980, American basketball coach and former player. Jared Graves, born 1982, Australian cyclist. Jared Green, born 1989, American football player. Jared Hammond, born 1982, American martial artist. Jared Harper, born 1997, American basketball player. Jared Hain, born 1984, Marshallese swimmer. Jared Hessfighter, born 1983, American mixed martial artist. Jared Hodgkiss, born 1986, English football player. Jared Hammond, born 1983, American basketball player. Jared Hoying, born 1989, American baseball player. Jared Hughes, born 1985, American baseball player. Jared Jarvis, born 1994, Tiga and Barbuda sprinter. Jared Jeffrey, born 1990, American soccer player. Jared Jeffries, born 1981, American basketball player. Jared Jenkins, born 1989, American football player. Jared Jordan, born 1984, American basketball player. Jared Kelly, born 2001, American baseball player. Jared Casa, born 1997, French football player. Jared Kirby, American fencing instructor and martial artist. Jared Coster, born 1991, Canadian football player. Jared Lackhind, born 1992, American baseball player. Jared Landers, born 1982, American racing driver. Jared Lewis, born 1982, St. Vincent and the Grenadines sprinter. Jared London, born 1995, Trinidadian and Tobagonians football player. Jared Lorenzen, 1981-2019, American football player. Jared Lum, born 1992, Australian soccer player. Jared Maiden, born 1998, American football player. Jared McKen, born 1996, Canadian ice hockey player. Jared McGee, American football player. Jared McGriff Culver, born 1989, American football player. Jared Mees, born 1986, American motorcycle racer. Jared Mitchell Baseball, born 1988, American baseball player. Jared Mills, born 1976, New Zealand Rugby League player. Jared Montz, born 1982, American soccer player. Jared Moon, born 1971, American baseball coach and former player. Jared Mortensen, born 1988, Canadian baseball player. Jared Newberry, born 1981, American football player. Jared Newson, born 1984, American basketball player. Jared Nickens, born 1994, American basketball player. Jared Nightingale, born 1982, American ice hockey player. Jared Norman, born 1974, English cricketer. Jared Norris, born 1993, American football player. Jared Odenbeck, born 1995, American soccer player. Jared Odrick, born 1987, American football player. Jared Oliva, born 1995, American baseball player. Jared Page, born 1993, New Zealand rugby union player. Jared Palmer, born 1971, American tennis player. Jared Pankia, born 1993, New Zealand field hockey player. Jared Papazian, born 1988, American mixed martial artist. Jared Payne, born 1985, New Zealand-born Irish rugby union player. Jared Peniston, born 1982, Bermudian football player. Jared Perry, born 1988, American football player. Jared Petrenko, born 1989, Australian rules football player. Jared Phillips, born 1995, Canadian soccer player. Jared Pinkney, born 1997, American football player. Jared Potch, born 1994, American baseball player. Jared Pollock, born 1992, Australian rules football player. Jared Poulton, born 1977, Australian rules football player. Jared Rando, born 1981, Australian mountain biker. Jared Reener, born 1982, American basketball player. Jared Rikowski, born 1983, American football player. Jared Rivers, born 1984, Australian rules football player. Jared Rollins, born 1977, American mixed martial artist. Jared Rosholt, born 1986, American mixed martial artist. Jared Ross, born 1982, American ice hockey player. Jared Rosser, born 1997, Welsh rugby union player. Jared Sandberg, born 1978, American baseball coach and former player. Jared Saunders, born 1990, South African rugby union player. Jared Savage, born 1997, American basketball player. Jared Sharmans, born 1987, American discus thrower. Jared Skip Shoemaker, born 1980, American baseball player. Jared Shuster, born 1998, American baseball player. Jared Simpson, born 1996, English rugby league player. Jared Sims, born 1993, English football player. Jared Smith, born 1990, American football player. Jared Spurgeon, born 1989, Canadian ice hockey player. Jared Stahl, born 1990, Canadian ice hockey player. Jared Stroud, born 1996, American soccer player. Jared Sullinger, born 1992, American basketball player. Jared Tollant, born 1984, Australian race walker. Jared Taylor, rugby league, born 1981, French rugby league player. Jared Thibault, born 1987, American radio-controlled car racer. Jared Terrell, born 1995, American basketball player. Jared Theodorakos, born 1981, American baseball player. Jared Timmer, born 1997, American soccer player. Jared Dutoit, born 1995, Canadian golfer. Jared Tomich, born 1974, American football player. Jared Velhier, born 1987, American football player. Jared Waria Hargreaves, born 1989, New Zealand rugby league player. Jared Walsh, born 1993, American baseball player. Jared Ward, born 1988, American long-distance runner. Jared Warner, born 1996, English cricketer. Jared Watts, born 1992, American soccer player. Jared Weaver, born 1982, American baseball player. Jared Wells, born 1981, American baseball player. Jared Wilson, footballer, born 1989, English football player. Jared Wolf, born 1988, American golfer. Jared Young, born 1995, Canadian baseball player. Jared Zabransky, born 1983, American football player. Jared Zezel, born 1991, American curler. Other people. Jared Carter, Latter-day Saints, 1801–1849, early American leader in the Latter-day Saint movement. Jared Crane, son of American businessman Jim Crane. Jared Kleinstein, American baseball fan who mimicked baseball player Tim Tebow for kneeling during the U.S. national anthem. Jared Lee Luffner, born 1988, American criminal who was arrested for the 2011 Tucson shooting. Jared C. Monty, 1975–2006, American soldier who was killed in action during the war in Afghanistan. Jared Pratt, 1769–1839, American and father of the Mormon pioneer brothers. Jared Remai, born 1978, American criminal who was involved in the assault and murder of Jennifer Martle. Jared Robinette, American police officer who was involved in the shooting of Stephon Clark. Fictional characters. Jared, fictional character from the television show Kids Incorporated, portrayed by Jared Delgen. Jared Afiki, fictional character from television show Shortland Street, portrayed by Beulah Cole. Jared Banks, fictional character from television show One Life to Live, portrayed by John Brotherton. Jared Casey, fictional character from television show Passions, portrayed by James Stevenson. Jared Dunn, fictional character from television show Silicon Valley TV series, portrayed by Zach Woods. Jared Garrity, fictional character from television show The Twilight Zone, portrayed by John Daner. Jared Evan Grace, fictional from the movie The Spiderwick Chronicles, portrayed by Freddie Highmore. Jared Hall, fictional character from the television show One Life Live, portrayed by Herve Clermont. Jared Haynes, fictional character from the television show Emmerdale, portrayed by Philip Hill Pearson. Jared Kincaid, fictional character from Jim Butcher's novel series The Dresden Files. Jared Kleinman, fictional character from the Broadway musical Dear Evan Hansen, portrayed by Alex Wise, Will Rowland, Jared Goldsmith, and Jack Loxton. Jared Levine, fictional character from the television show All Saints TV series, portrayed by Ben Tari. Jared Munter Mason, fictional character from the television show Outrageous Fortune TV series, portrayed by Tammy Davis. Jared Morello, fictional character from the DC Comics series Rogues. Jared Morello Arrowverse, fictional character from the television show The Flash 2014 TV series, portrayed by Stephen Hussar. Jared Namak, fictional character from the movie Blade 2, portrayed by Luke Goss. Jared Vasquez, fictional character from Manifest TV series, portrayed by J.R. Ramirez. Jared Bakravan, fictional character from James Clavell's novel Whirlwind. Jared Vance, portrayed by Akinsola Arimbo, son of fictional character. References